thank you to the Chicago Humanities Festival. It's really a pleasure to be a part of the festival. And to welcome Mitchell Duneier back to Chicago, the place where he began his studies of race in the city. It's really a pleasure to be with you all. So I'd love to start by asking Mitch, this book is about intellectuals and their journey, and you are an intellectual, and you have had a journey. And so I'm curious, what brought you to this topic that has produced Ghetto, the invention of a place, the history of an idea?
Thanks, Mary. And I just want to say it's a great honor to be interviewed by you. Your books, Black Picket Fences and Black on the Block, are classic urban ethnographies that have had a big influence on the way that I think. So this is wonderful for me. I mean, I guess that this is a book that really tries to bring the Black ghetto and the Jewish ghetto into some kind of articulation with one another. And the way it came into being is that it was really sort of an outgrowth of my consciousness as a Jewish person who grew up in an era when the Jewish ghetto was actually more prominently referenced in books and magazines than the Black ghetto. And I have this chart up here, this chart which is an effort to sort of count all of the references to the word ghetto in books and that were cataloged by Google. And just to illustrate, the year that I was born was 1961. Is there a light on here coming out?
It might have been turned off.
No. Oh, maybe I'm pushing the wrong one.
There
Okay.
you go.
So 1961 is right over here, and you could see that in 1961, the Jewish ghetto, there's more references to Jewish ghettos than Black ghettos in books cataloged by Google. And when you think of it, 1961, the year that I was born, that was the year that Raoul Hilberg published his great book, The Destruction of the European Jews, which kind of inaugurated an entire field of Holocaust scholarship. And it was a period right around a year before, or a year after Elie Wiesel published the book Night, and right before, Eichmann in Jerusalem. And a certain consciousness of what had happened during the Nazi ghettos, or in the Nazi ghettos and in the Nazi era, came into a full flowering in a way that it had not even in the previous decades. And growing up at that particular moment, for me, as a Jewish person, when I heard the word ghetto, I would constantly hear references to what went on in Eastern Europe. Now, I grew up in a segregated Jewish neighborhood on Long Island where I was living in a bubble from the civil rights movement that was happening right outside and around me. But of course, as you can see, it's only a few years later that the transformation occurs in around 1965, and Black ghetto now then begins its rise as the hegemonic reference. So by the time that I became a graduate student at the University of Chicago, when I started graduate school, when we talked about the ghetto, there was never any reference to the Jewish ghettos. And I always wondered if there was any connection between these things, if it made sense to think about them in relationship to one another. That was kind of something that's been a longstanding concern and something that was on my mind at that particular moment.
But you didn't explore it right away. So you are best known for your books Slim's Table and Sidewalk, both of which are ethnographies of the city, ethnographies of race in the city. So then what brought you back to this idea, and how did your experience as an ethnographer affect this is an historical book, this is an archival book. How did your experience as an ethnographer affect your use of archival sources and so on?
So the book is really about what it ended up being is a book about intellectuals, and it's about four different sort of thinkers and sort of at times you might also say activists who had a conception of the ghetto at particular historical moments. So there's a chapter on Horace Cayton, who co-authored the book Black Metropolis with Clair Drake in the 1940s, and then there's a chapter on Kenneth Clark, the psychologist turned ethnographer, sort of sociologist who wrote the book Dark Ghetto in the 1960s, and then a chapter on William Julius Wilson and his conception of the ghetto in the Reagan and post-Reagan eras, and then finally Geoffrey Canada, the activist, education reformer, community organizer who has been so influential in Harlem today. And in the case of the first two of these authors who had such a major influence on the way that sociology and the social sciences and even the country would think about what the ghetto was, they were both ethnographers. Mm-hmm. And so I felt as though I was really writing about my sort of intellectual lineage, the people that I owed so much to as an ethnographer and whose work I had learned so much from. And I think that I was particularly sensitive to the kinds of struggles that they would have had as intellectuals and as scholars because I've done some of that kind of work myself. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the ways. And then the other thing I would say is that there's many different kinds of ethnography. Ethnography, of course, is a method in which people go out into the world and they study other people at first hand. Sometimes they engage in the activities that those people engage in. You know, when I wrote Slim's Table about the Valois cafeteria for my dissertation on the south side of Chicago, it was based on going to that cafeteria every day for many years and then getting to know the people in it. And those are the kinds of things that ethnographers do. And one of the things that some ethnographers do is they actually place a lot of priority on showing the people. And that's been kind of what my approach has been in some of my books, has been to sort of develop the people as fully rounded characters and to show who some of the people are behind the statistics. And I think that I kind of brought that approach to this book, except the people were not the people I met, the subjects at Slim's Table or Sidewalk, but they were people I met through archives.
Mm-hmm. Have you gotten any pushback from historians? Do historians want to guard their territory against sociologists? Do they think the way that a sociologist has approached this, a topic that historians, obviously, Ghetto, the topic that historians have very much treated, have you gotten any pushback?
Well, I mean, I think that the book is, could be criticized, I think, by historians, and I'm sure that it will be criticized by historians. And I've already heard, some good critiques of some of the things that I've done. But I think that in general, the historians have been very generous to me, and I've been very grateful for their openness to having an outsider write something. I will say that I really have learned how hard it is to do archival research. I thought that what we do as ethnographers is hard, but now I've seen what's really hard.
So can you give us a sense of kind of what do we learn from comparing the Jewish ghetto to the Black ghetto? What are some of the major insights that you feel like you came away from this exercise?
So, I mean, the book really tries to, in trying to bring these ghettos into articulation with one another, really asks about the relevance of one for the other. And I think that there's a variety of ways to approach the question. First of all, one of the most interesting things for me was to discover that it was during the Nazi era that African American intellectuals really took up the idea of the ghetto in a significant way. And one of the interesting things on this chart here is that if you look at, this is 1928 here, which is when the first restrictive covenants went into effect in Chicago and St. Louis, segregating blacks on the basis of notions of racial purity. So, and if you look at the word ghetto, the word ghetto as a notion that would have referred to kind of a forced segregation could have risen starting in 1928, but it actually doesn't. And this is also true if you look at the black newspapers as well. It doesn't rise until this particular moment during the Nazi era. And so when I went through the books and magazines that were written by black, and the articles that were written by black intellectuals, one of the things that I found was that black intellectuals were not trying to make a comparison to the Nazi ghettos. They were not trying to say, well, what's going on in Chicago is like what's going on in Europe. Mm-hmm. What they were really trying to say is that there's a hypocrisy here, that our sons are over there liberating these camps, and at the exact same moment that they're over here, our neighborhoods are being segregated on the basis of these notions of racial purity. In some of the writing, you get even the sense that they're trying to say, look, we are America's Jews, and you have to pay attention to us the way that you're paying attention to the situation over there. And so that was one of the sort of the interesting things that came out of this for me, because I don't think that, today we use the word ghetto in a whole variety of ways, and there are many people, of course, who would like to dispense with it, which is fine. But one of the things that I was hoping for in writing this book was for people to understand a little bit of what was at stake for the people who actually took up that word to begin with. Another issue that I think is very important is that, the Venice ghetto and the Nazi ghettos were two Jewish experiences that were actually very, very different from one another, right? Like one of the things I argue in the book is that the word ghetto itself, that the idea that word could be used by Adolf Hitler, was just extraordinary, right? Because the word ghetto itself came into being in Venice in 1516 for the forced segregation of the Jews, but it was a place where they could actually earn a living and where some parts of their lives could actually semi-flourish, right? And there is vast evidence of that semi-flourishing in Venice. And at the other extreme, you have then the use of the word ghetto for a situation which was going to lead to nothing but death and destruction. And in that sense, you have two ghetto experiences that highlight, on the one hand, extreme social control, the most extreme that we've ever seen, and on the other hand, a kind of semi-flourishing. And I think that ghettos, in general, need to be understood as being about both of those things. Mm-hmm. And I think that having the Jewish ghetto as that framework can help us focus our attention on those phenomena.
So you just referenced this when you said some people would love to dispense with the word. So I'd like to spend a little time talking about the word ghetto as a word. So the book is about the invention of a place, the history of an idea, and it is both of those things. But I'd also like to think about what kind of word is it? Is it an analytical term like stratification or intersectionality that academics should be the only ones who get to use? Not that only academics use stratification, but it's not something that you're talking on the bus stop with somebody about. Or is it a descriptive word like Latino or Southern that just describes a place? Or is it a slur and thus something that shouldn't be used in polite company? I often think, as a sociologist who studies race, people love to have really catchy book titles, and I always wonder when I'm reading on the plane or on the train or something, and I'm wondering, people are looking at this book title. And so, should our audience, as they're on the plane or train, should they be thinking they might get unwanted stares when they're looking at the book title, which has the word in big, bold letters? So what kind of word is ghetto, and kind of where do you think its future is? How would you advise our audience if they should be using it in their everyday language?
I think that it's all of those things, and it's a word that academics can't control, and it's a word that in different historical eras takes on different meaning and significance. And it's like there was, during the 1970s, Harvey Milk was able to use that word to crystallize a certain conception of the gay movement that was extremely important in that particular moment. That would have been completely unanticipated. And today the word ghetto has many negative connotations associated with it. But I think that what we really need to do is, I don't even know if I would personally be reading that book on the subway, because I agree with you. It's a weird feeling, but I would read it in my house just, or to try to develop sort of an understanding of what the history of that word. And then, I think it's for each individual to decide in the particular sort of social situations in which they are in, and the moments in which that word might or might not come up, whether or not it's the right word for them to use at the particular moment.
Mm-hmm. This tension between semi-flourishing and forced control, oppression, it's a tension that runs throughout the book. I think it's really an important insight. So important that I'm not even quite sure where I want to begin with my question. There are two ways I'm thinking about the question. One is it's a trope that Drake and Cayton use very strongly in Black Metropolis when they juxtapose the Black Ghetto on the one hand and Bronzeville on the other, with Bronzeville semi-flourishing and the Black Ghetto being that kind of instantiation of control. And then I'm also thinking, so you can take this whichever way you want, about what seems to be your conclusion at the end, that the contemporary Black communities are more on the end of control and oppression than on semi-flourishing. So go talk about the tension somehow, and either through the intellectuals or through the characterization of today's Black communities.
Yeah. Well, Drake and Cayton, so they were these two graduate students at the University of Chicago, and they were coming up, in an era after it became clear that the University of Chicago was instrumental in creating the ghetto on the South Side through the use of restrictive covenants. And a good part of the chapter on Cayton and Drake is about their recognition of that as graduate students at the University of Chicago and what they wanted to do about that, how they wanted to bring that to the attention of their professors, and how they wanted to write about that in this first great book about the ghetto, Black Metropolis. And they saw the ghetto as really being a function, on the one hand, of the tightening noose that was being placed around this community such that Blacks could not move outward, and they were, through more and more overcrowding, people were constantly having to divide up apartments, and this was leading to all kinds of pathological conditions, including but not limited to the juvenile delinquency that was the original basis of the study before it expanded into something much bigger. And so they called the community, whenever they referred to all of these bigger problems that were a result directly attributable to the restrictive covenant, they referred to these things, they referred to it as the ghetto. But then that same exact physical space, they have chapter after chapter about the flourishing life of the South Side. And whenever they refer to that aspect of the very same physical space, they refer to it as Bronzeville. And so what they're trying to do is to bring into the minds of the reader that this community is like a coin with two sides, and that you have to have both in your mind at all moments and at all times. And they emphasize at many points in the book that many people in this community would prefer to live in this community and around Blacks, that their aspiration is not to live around whites. It's that they want to be able to expand outward, but the flourishing parts of their life here are things that they greatly value. What's interesting is that as I was reading through and learning about the other intellectuals who conceived of the ghetto in different eras, for example, in the 1960s, the next great person being Kenneth Clark, that it became harder and harder for the intellectuals of later eras to spend as much time on the flourishing of the community. It wasn't that they didn't recognize that it existed, but there was a sense that there had been a decline in it. And I think that probably there would be a few people that would argue today that we haven't moved further away from the flourishing and more in the direction of control as a result of many factors, right? So everything ranging from the outmigration of the Black middle class, which William Julius Wilson, so effectively wrote about and highlighted at a point when it was not as widely known as it is today, but also other factors such as deindustrialization and other things which have made it more difficult for those neighborhoods to flourish as they did in the 1940s.
So, but is it possible that nostalgia is what keeps many of the observers that you've documented in the book from seeing the continuing semi-flourishing in Black communities? I think about Jeffrey Canada, who you talk about, whose book was Fists, something, Knives, Guns?
Fist, stick, knife, gun.
Stick, knife, gun. And it was kind of a nostalgia to his growing up when you fought with fists, And the contemporary Harlem, he grew up in the South Bronx, the contemporary Harlem, people are fighting with guns. So there's a certain nostalgia there. There's the nostalgia that Kenneth Clark has looking back to Drake and Cayton, and surely William Julius Wilson has this nostalgia for what he calls the institutional ghetto of Drake and Cayton, and the jobless ghetto that he studies in the 80s. Just for in Black Metropolis, Horace Cayton and St. Clair Drake say that there are 5 dominating interests in Bronzeville. They are staying alive, having fun, serving God, getting ahead, and advancing the race. Are those dominating interests not still the things that drive people in Black communities today?
Absolutely. And I really think that any time that we talk about this dichotomy, you know, it's very possible to go down the road of talking about the Black community the way that Donald Trump talked about the inner city, you know? And I do think that in that conceptualization of it, you know, you have, you know, no soul, no inner life, no semi-flourishing, you know. So one doesn't want to, I'm certainly not trying to articulate a sociological theory like that.
And I think Slim's Table, part of Slim's Table was about the semi-flourishing as a response to what had been an overarching story about the control and oppression.
Yeah, but also Slim's Table really was about a group of African-American men who hung out at the Valois cafeteria in Hyde Park and who themselves had watched the ghettos around them change and transform to a point where they felt as though the lessons that they had learned working in factories and other places in the industrial economy were no longer valued by young people anymore who were growing up with such a different experience.
So I think related to this question or emphasis on semi-flourishing versus control is the whole question of class and poverty. And I think the book sometimes isn't as crystal clear about if the word ghetto applies. At one point you say that ghettos are efforts to, quote, restrict space in the service of racial purity. So there it's quite clear that ghettos are about separation for the aims of racial purity. But then this idea of class and poverty comes up frequently, and towards the end of the book, you ask about the, quote, significance of the idea of the ghetto for understanding the situation of poor Blacks today. And you hone in more on poor Black neighborhoods, which is something that William Julius Wilson did. But then it raises the question to me, are ghettos only the space of poor Blacks? And were ghettos only the space of poor Jewish people? And what is the role of class in our conceptualization of ghetto over time and over place?
That's a very important question. So, you know, in different historical eras, these different intellectuals have articulated different visions for what the ghetto was. So the idea of the ghetto as a space which was fully bound up with notions of racial purity, that was really a notion of the ghetto from the 1940s, right? From the 30s and the 40s, because that was during the Nazi era. So that's when it crystallized. But by the time you get to Kenneth Clark's work, he's not really thinking of the ghetto in terms of racial purity anymore. He's thinking of it in terms of as a space, a phenomenon of control. And he's emphasizing even more than Drake and Cayton did the ghetto as a place that is completely controlled by white society, in which the people living in it are living in it almost as though they are colonial subjects, and they are living with a sense of humiliation from the welfare system, from the apparatus of government that is having such a big influence on their lives, and even from philanthropists who will continue to play a big role in the ghetto. And by the time that you get to Wilson in the 80s and the 90s, we're talking about a conception of the ghetto that is really not really about control and not really about racial purity, but is about deindustrialization and class and political economy in a different kind of way. And then, of course, by the time we get to Geoffrey Canada, we're talking about an era that is known as neoliberalism, in which there's a retrenchment of state efforts and much more of an emphasis on privatization and philanthropy in the case of the Harlem Children's Zone. And so I would agree with you that today the ghetto is much less about notions of racial purity than it is about some of these other factors.
Actually, I'm not sure if you're agreeing with me. You're agreeing with what you wrote in the book, which I think is is important,
Okay.
that you agree with yourself,
Okay.
because actually my kind of challenge would be, and I'm not, well, my challenge would be if there are still mechanisms of separation in the attempt of racial purity that controls the spaces of non-poor blacks as well as poor blacks.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I was
I mean,
going
I
with
think
that.
it would, that's a really important point. I mean, I think it would definitely be some combination of race and class, that would be the factor.
There's so many, I have so many questions, you all, so I'm trying to figure out which way I want to go. This is an intellectual history. There are a number of people that you walk through. We've talked about a few of them. Cayton, Kenneth Clark, we've hit on a little bit. I guess I'll ask, pick who you want to talk about, your favorite. What story did you really enjoy telling? Who would you like to talk about?
Well, one of the things that I found to be the most interesting from the archives was understanding the significance of the Swedish scholar, economist, Gunnar Myrdal. And because he really looms large over this entire story, he was very important in the life of both Horace Cayton, who was so significant in the 40s, and then also Kenneth Clark. And Myrdal, as many of you know, was the author of the book An American Dilemma, which was published in 1944 and was really the most important and influential work of social science on race for many decades to come. And he was an economist that was brought over here from Sweden by the Carnegie Corporation that wanted to come up with an alternative to thinking differently about race that was different from the way that it was being approached through, say, the Chicago School of Sociology. The Chicago School believed that race was something that could only change through very natural forces over time. And the Carnegie Corporation was interested in if we could learn actually about what is going on in the United States in terms of race, would there be a way to use that effectively so that we could actually intervene and have this knowledge be the basis of social change and social transformation? And so they looked all over, and they looked for somebody that they thought could be kind of a modern-day Tocqueville, that could come with the objectivity of an outsider, that could write something that would have a legitimacy in the minds of both blacks and white Americans. And so they looked for somebody who came from a country with non-imperialist traditions, and they came up with Myrdal, and they invited him to come over here, and they offered him more money than any social scientist had ever been offered in the history of the social sciences to do the project. And they basically sent him a telegram inviting him to do it, and he thought it was completely ridiculous, and he turned it down. But then they persevered, and some great officials of the Carnegie Corporation, whose stories deserve their own work, their own documentation, these officials persevered, and they brought him, and they convinced him to come over here, and he moved with his wife, who herself would ultimately go on to win the Nobel Prize for peace. He would end up winning the Nobel Prize for economics many years later. They brought them over, and he undertakes this monumental study of race in America. And one of the people that he tried to hire in order to do his study was Horace Cayton, a graduate student at Chicago who is working already on his book, Black Metropolis. He heard that Cayton had accumulated all these materials for this major study of the South Side. And part of what the book is about is it shows how the back and forth between these two, and how he tried to get Cayton to move to New York and to become one of his assistants. And Cayton said to him, look, I'm willing to do it, but only if you will give me the money to write my own book. And I have to get full credit for all of the materials that I have here, otherwise I'm not going to show them to you at all. And Myrdal, who already had working for him as assistants many of the leading top sociologists and psychologists in the country, couldn't believe that this graduate student was actually pushing him around. And Cayton was a fascinating, or was pushing back like this, and Cayton was a fascinating guy with a tremendous sense of entitlement and a tremendous amount of self-confidence. He was the grandson of the first black U.S. senator in the U.S., from the state of Washington. He was the son of a publisher of an important newspaper in Seattle. He had met many of the greatest figures in the United States growing up. And so he was used to dealing with people like Myrdal. And he basically refused, and they could not come to an agreement. And ultimately, Myrdal wrote the book without those materials. And part of what I argue in the book is that, that ultimately Myrdal's book would become largely irrelevant because he would ultimately fail to understand the nature of white racism in the North. And by the time that the 1960s came along, people started to realize how naive Myrdal's book had been. And one of the questions that I ask is how that might have been different if he had had the benefit of Cayton's materials, because Black Metropolis ended up being a book that not only told about the life of the blacks on the South Side, but also about the whites, the tavern owners, and the many people who ran the institutions of Chicago and their essentially racist views. So that was one very interesting sort of relationship for me between Myrdal and a figure in the book. And the other one was between Myrdal and Kenneth Clark, because Clark was a graduate student at Columbia at the time that Myrdal was writing his book. And he found out that Myrdal was working in the basement of the Columbia Library. And he sought a meeting with Myrdal and asked if he could be a research assistant on the project. And this became a very influential thing in Clark's career as Clark started to understand and see the importance of scholarship for social change and social transformation. And he and Myrdal ended up having a lifelong relationship.
So speaking of relationships, alongside this story, this historical story of the use of the word ghetto to apply to Jewish ghettos and then black ghettos, there are a number of Jewish and black individuals who are associating at the same time and having their various relationships. So there's Louis Wirth and Horace Cayton. There's Kenneth Clark and Marion Rosenwald. So there are philanthropists, there are intellectuals, and a number of relationships. So I wonder if you'd talk a bit about some of these associations about philanthropy, about scholarship between actual Jewish people and actual black people as opposed to the concept.
Right, no, that's a great point. Louis Wirth was the professor at the University of Chicago. He was a German Jew. He had come here from Germany as a teenager, and he, as a graduate student at the University of Chicago in 1928, introduced the idea of the ghetto into sociology to try to explain the nature of communities in which people congregate largely by choice. And he really wanted to use the ghetto as a metaphor that came out of Jewish history, and it was something that he thought could be applied to other groups such as Chinese and blacks and others. And he ended up becoming one of the mentors of Horace Cayton and St. Clair Drake. He worked very closely with them, and he could hardly have imagined, of course, that their work would have resulted in, or been part of a movement, I should say, that would have resulted in a transformation of the word ghetto from being a word that would be mainly about Jews, as he introduced it, to being about African Americans. And that was a very constructive relationship. Alternatively, Kenneth Clark, he and his wife, Mamie Clark, after they finished graduate school, started a very important social service agency in Harlem to try to help Harlem youth. And in many ways, it prefigured the things that Jeffrey Canada would do many years later in the Harlem Children's Zone, because it was an attempt to approach the community and its problems in an all-encompassing way, and looking at the total life of a person rather than trying to focus on particular individual parts of it. And he had the support of this woman, Marion Rosenwald, who was a Chicago Jew, and she had moved to New York, and she was funding much of this. And at a certain point in time, she became very, very forceful in trying to push the Clarks to pursue her vision for what needed to be done, which was very different. And she threatened them and said that she was going to pull out all of her money. And it meant basically that they would have to close down, or they would have to go begging to other sources, which might never be able to fund what they were doing. And they decided that they, rather than be told what to do by this woman, that they were going to tell her, basically, to take her money and go. And this is a very important part of the book because it's the moment when Clark develops his conception of social work colonialism, which became the basis of his ideas about the ghetto as a colonial entity. And it was through that intense personal experience that he had dealing with Rosenwald that he started to really think about all of the multiple ways that the ghetto was actually a place of control and a kind of colonial, using a kind of colonial framework. And for me, it was very moving to read this because I've always felt as though we frequently don't have enough of an understanding of the ways in which the perspectives that have come to become dominant in our field are actually based upon personal experiences that people have that lead them to have certain kinds of ideas.
That's very, very important. I want to touch on the topic of integration or assimilation, which has been something that observers of ghettos have had to deal with all along. So you have a story, a kind of indirect debate between Louis Wirth and historian Salo Barron, in which Barron says, quote, that he believed that Jews had in many respects been better off with a full and rounded life in the ghetto, and thus he concluded that assimilation was not in their interest. And Louis Wirth didn't share that, and I'm just curious kind of what have been some of the other perspectives on this question of integration or assimilation or basically the dissipation of ghettos?
You know, I'm really glad that you brought that up because in the 1920s, there was real debate among Jewish intellectuals about assimilation, and Salo Barron is really perhaps the greatest scholar in the history of Jewish studies, or certainly one of them. And he articulated a clear view in 1928, the same year that Wirth would publish his book, The Ghetto, that the Jews had lost so much by not being in ghettos, that so much of their social and cultural life had been sacrificed by integration. So many of the intellectual accomplishments that had occurred in the ghetto were sacrificed for the integration. And yet sociologists really took a very different view. And the whole Chicago School of Sociology was based on the idea that integration was better. And I think that for Wirth, it was really about, he was a German Jew, and like many German Jews at the time, they saw the Polish Jews in Chicago that were coming later as an embarrassment. And they felt as though they needed to integrate them into the society if these Polish Jews were not going to actually reflect badly on the Germans that had come before. Now, this dilemma between sort of assimilation on the one hand and segregation on the other has been a continuous theme, of course, with black ghettos as well, as there's been continuous debates about whether it's better to just tear the ghettos down and move people out, as we've seen in some of the experiments that have taken place with moving to opportunity and others, or whether it's better to just strengthen and build those communities up. And these are eternal dilemmas of sociology.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to open up to the audience, which actually gets at where you were ending there, because it's a bit of a policy question, and the book does not take on policy and make policy recommendations, which sociologists often like to do, and I think you were right to kind of, this is an intellectual history, but so now I'm going to ask you to do that a little bit. So, you have William Julius Wilson's idea of kind of a New Deal full employment jobs program. You have Geoffrey Canada's kind of cradle to college services, especially through education. And now we have President-elect Trump, who loves the word inner cities and loves to have Chicago be that iconic inner city, and perhaps inner city is a synonym for ghetto. What do you think a Trump presidency will mean for the prospective history of ghettos? Is that an unfair question?
No.
Because it's the reality.
Yes. No, I don't think it's unfair at all. So, I think that if I was going to make a prediction, I would say the following. Number one, we are going to have very likely Attorney General Giuliani, and maybe it won't be. It's too early to tell right now, but that's what's on the front pages of the papers today. If it's not Giuliani, it will be somebody like Giuliani. And Giuliani was the architect of the broken windows approach to urban policing in New York City. He is basically the architect of what became the stop and frisk approach to maintaining order in New York City. And that is part of a way of thinking about the ghetto as a phenomenon of extreme social control. And I would expect that that overall ideological framework would be central to any kind of Trump approach to the city. On the other hand, I would say that, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Trump, who did get certainly a higher percentage of the black vote than some of us were expecting. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see him in very strategic ways make moves in particular American cities where those black votes could help him win the next election, and do the kinds of projects that Jeffrey Canada tried to do in Harlem. I think that he has the advantage of anything that he does will not necessarily get blocked by a Republican Congress. So things that President Obama would have liked to have done, even on a small scale, he may be able to do very strategically on a small scale as well.
So let's open it up for questions. We have a microphone, and please wait for the microphone to come around to you because this is being video recorded. So to be sure to get the question, we'll have to make sure you get the mic to you. So we'll open it up for questions.
One of the major issues in the middle of your chart there that occurred in the mid-50s was the segregation of the school system, and which resulted in many cases, especially in the northern cities, with busing children from the inner city into surrounding neighborhoods. What impact do you see that having on the maintenance of the ghetto life, or the desire to move out of it, or the opening of the boundaries so that others would move in?
So one of the interesting issues that came up in the book was that, in the research that I wrote about, had to do with Kenneth Clark's sort of evolution of his thinking on the issue of segregation of schools. Clark was the person who, in his earlier life, before he wrote the book Dark Ghetto, he undertook the famous doll experiments that were the basis of proving that segregation leads to feelings of inferiority for blacks. And that, of course, that important experiment was cited by the US Supreme Court in Brown. And Clark was thought to be somebody who was largely in favor of school busing, who was largely in favor of achieving integration. And during the 1970s, he basically turned against many of the people that were in the movement with him and said that, we cannot, for ideological purposes, sacrifice a generation of young people trying to move them out of the ghetto on buses, when what we really need to be doing is improving these schools. And so right there, right in Clark himself, you saw this dilemma, and he disappointed some people by taking that stand, but that was ultimately the view that he had.
Thank you. It sounds like the Jewish ghetto aspect has kind of faded because there's not the ghettos in Europe or anywhere else, and the emphasis has shifted to the black ghettos. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Just last weekend, which indeed was 2 days before the election, I had the privilege of hearing Bishop Catherine Jefferts Schori, immediately presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church of the United States. And people asked her about reconciliation. What are we going to do when this election is over? What's going to happen? And she said that the best course, what she wanted to see, is that we would be able to get to the root causes of the problems that we're experiencing and the difference and the need for reconciliation. In this matter of the ghettos, what would you see as a root cause that we would want to get to today and do something about?
Well, you know, one of the major arguments of the book that I haven't really emphasized in this discussion so far is that I'm really trying to push back against many of the approaches that we've seen over the years, which have tried to boil the problems of the ghetto down to a single root cause. What I'm really trying to kind of do is to return to an earlier framework that I see in the work of Cayton and Drake, who even they did not see the ghetto as the single thing that, you know, if you solve this problem, then you're going to solve all of the problems of African Americans. And I think that really the way we need to think about these problems is as a multi-generational phenomenon. It's something that came into being over generations, and it's something that needs to be attacked and thought through as a multi-generational solution as well. It's not something that's going to be solved by moving people out of a neighborhood and then watching to see whether or not they got a job 6 months later or 2 years later. It's something that, you know, I argue at the end of the book that when the Jews were emancipated from their ghettos, it took generations before they were integrated into the society. And I think that we need to really think about this in a multi-causal way. And although I'm somewhat critical of Geoffrey Canada in the book, if many of the things that were being done by Geoffrey Canada were taken up by the government instead of by private philanthropists, I would think that that kind of sort of multifaceted approach to the problem would be a very, very good thing for us to take as a model.
There's integration and there's assimilation. And one of the things I think that we have now is not only ghettos to put people down, but you have ghettos of the privileged to avoid integration. And how you talked about, for example, in Chicago, the white attitudes. So how do you avoid the ghetto of the privileged? Gated communities are, in a sense, ghettos of the privileged.
Yeah, I don't know, that may be above my pay grade, but I am, one thing that I should emphasize though is that the word ghetto itself, I personally feel is, I agree with the way you used it in that context, but I personally believe that the best use of the word in terms of what we learn from the history of the social sciences and its use is that all of these scholars were trying to emphasize that poor black neighborhoods were actually neighborhoods that were different, not in degree, but in kind from other communities in the city. And a lot of that has to do, at this moment, in terms of poor blacks, in terms of their, the historic ways in which these neighborhoods have been deprived. But I think that the word ghetto itself, when it's used to understand that difference in kind rather than degree, is probably one of the greatest legacies of the work that's been done by the black intellectuals.
If I could just jump in, I will say it's an interesting, one of the reasons why it's a challenge to use the word in that way is that the use of the word has often had this component of forced. And of course, rich people aren't forced to live with rich people, and so that connotation of that part of the word doesn't really apply. But on the other hand, what I like about the use of the word in this context is that the word ghetto often suggests a collection of dysfunctional behaviors. And I think that concentration in affluent neighborhoods can do that too. Broad senses of entitlement, overuse of resources, any number of things that we can think about as ultimately dysfunctional for a fair and just society happen in such neighborhoods as well. And so in that respect, I think it's a good use of the word.
Yeah.
I guess I'm interested in the kind of the colonialism of knowledge and the colonialism of the philanthropy and where the money is going. And I'm wondering, so what do we do with what you've written about? And what do we do with the fact that we have such a range of background knowledges, and how do we get more of that? I mean, I came here expecting to see a very mixed audience, and you can see even here we have a very, at least on the first floor, a very predominantly white audience. And I think we're perpetuating through our bad schools this kind of colonial knowledge. What do we do with all of this knowledge?
It sounds like someone wants to build on this question. Is that right?
In other societies, words may appear like slums in India, favelas, and so forth. I'm wondering how useful it is to think comparatively about this topic.
Okay. So as far as the second question goes, I think that one of the things that I argue at the end of the book is that most of what we know in the social sciences about ghettos in the United States actually comes from two cities, Chicago and New York. That what we need really are more broader comparative studies of these communities, because there are very big differences, right? Chicago is a city where you could say isolation of blacks is more dominant than in New York, where the housing projects are much more integrated in with the rest of the society. And I think likewise that the social sciences right now are certainly missing that great comparative historical study that might bring some of those things into articulation with one another. And I think that that's something for this new generation of scholars to be thinking about. As far as your question goes, I mean, I think that there is a certain colonialism of knowledge, but I think that it's also significant to realize that the greatest books on these topics and some of the greatest work on this topic has historically been done by black scholars, such as the people that are being discussed in this book.
A lot of the owners or landlords in the black ghetto were white. Who were the landlords or the owners in the Jewish ghetto?
Well, that's an interesting question. But first of all, many of the landlords in the black ghetto, of course, were white and Jewish, which had its own tension associated with it. As far as who the landlords were in the Jewish ghettos of Chicago, the answer is, I don't really know. Oh, well, there were no German ghettos. The ghettos in the Nazi ghettos were in Eastern Europe. They were in Poland and, well, basically the Jews were moved into neighborhoods that were essentially taken away and appropriated by the state. In Venice, the Jews were moved into an area that was a former copper foundry, and they were essentially given housing in that space. And I don't really know exactly who they were renting from, or whether they were renting from each other, or what the answer to that question would be.
That's the question.
History is often written by the dominant social class or the dominant social group. And so looking at this graph and hearing about the book, I'm wondering how the story might be different if somehow we were magically able to capture the voices of people who may not be included in a historical archive.
I'm sorry, I don't completely understand the question. Could you repeat it or say it differently?
How would this graph, or how would your book, and how would the general story of ghettos be different if we were able to capture the voices of people who have not been recorded historically?
Well, all of these books that I'm talking about were based upon interviews and participation in the lives of the people that were living in those communities.
Maybe it's related to the question that I was going to ask, which is you, throughout the book, talk about that women's experiences weren't particularly foregrounded in Kenneth Clark's work and so on, and the idea that what would a history of the ghetto look like if it were written from the perspective of women?
Right.
Is one group perhaps that isn't as well represented in the archives.
Right. So one of the things that I try to do in the book is to look through in different historical eras what was the place of women in the accounts, because of the fact that all of these books are written by men. And you can see that in some cases, some of the results of this analysis are really surprising, like Kenneth Clark, who is working so closely with Mamie Phipps Clark as a collaborator, who herself has a PhD in psychology from Columbia University. He gives absolutely no voice at all to women in his account. Whereas Cayton and Drake, they have a lot more space devoted to the lives of women. There's a variation in the extent to which women are included in all of these thinkers. But one thing that we can definitely say is that there's never been a really feminist conception of the ghetto. There's never been an idea of the ghetto that has developed that has really placed the concerns of women at the forefront. And one of the interesting places where you see this, just as a current example, is in one of the major theories of what we needed to do about the ghettos coming out of the last generation was the spatial mismatch hypothesis, and the ways in which blacks were increasingly living away from their jobs, and from where the jobs were, and we needed to create better systems of transportation so that poor blacks could be transported, say, to the outerlying areas where jobs were being created. Well, when this vision or this theory was being articulated, there was really no sort of discussion at the time of, well, what would this have meant for women who have childcare responsibilities, who have all kinds of who are raising children by themselves, and in terms of the kind of travel that they would have to do, et cetera, things of that sort. So, and I do think that for this generation of scholars, that's a really interesting issue in general, is to think about the ghetto from that perspective.
And this is going to be our last question up here.
So I'm thinking a lot about problems, and I work at a high school, and I like that you said that to solve the problems, we have to look at this from a multi-generational perspective. And I'm really wondering what you say to people who want to deny history, or at least, not take responsibility for it, in the sense that they say, slavery was a long time ago, Jim Crow was a long time ago, that was in the past. And I'm wondering how you think people can address that to those who don't want to acknowledge that past.
Well, you have to encourage people to read history. And, there's also been some very good books written about reparations lately as an idea. And I think that that's a concept that we need to continue to be thinking about in our society.
So I hear that was the last question, so I'm going to have to wrap it up, but invite everyone. There will be a book signing downstairs with Professor Duneier, and thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.